Hello and welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. This week we're talking to the Pulitzer Prize finalist Eowyn Ivey, who is back with her third novel in 14 years. It's called Blackwood's Blue Sky. We talk about why she keeps saying that she won't write again, only to find herself writing again a few years later.
I feel like it's just this feeling I can't resist. I think that when I'm out, for a run or a ski or I'm washing dishes, my brain just goes there almost against my will. I start thinking of storylines or things I want to express, and it feels like I keep getting kind of pulled in against my will to some extent. And it has happened already. I'm already starting to toy with ideas, and my family laughs at me because I think, no, I don't want to do this again in ways. There's certainly parts of it that I really enjoy. I feel like there's these moments where, things just click and you're writing and it feels like I'm doing what I've always wanted to do and it's working. But other times it's a struggle. It's hard work. And I'm always a little resistant to go back into that process.
Also, why for her, success would never really dictate any story decisions.
In terms of getting published, I'm very fortunate that The Snow Child did as well as it did, because it allows me opportunities to have editors look at my work and be interested in it maybe more quickly than they would have been otherwise. So that's that's the greatest blessing of having a book do well, is that you're taken seriously as you're working on something. But beyond that, it wouldn't, the success or failure of a book doesn't really affect what I do next. As I said, that kind of just comes from some sort of internal drive as I slowly start to get interested in something new, a new story to tell.
It's all on the way with Eowyn Ivey in a brand new Writer's Routine. Yes, welcome along to the show. My name is Dan Simpson and this is Writer's Routine. Thank you so much for listening. We are the podcast that takes a look inside an author's working day to see how, when, why, and what authors do. How do they get stuff down and then get it onto the shelves so you can buy it? And I don't want to sound like this is blowing my own trumpet at all. I just had quite a lot of messages, really, that have said how inspirational and impactful this podcast has been in getting you to write, and I'm really appreciative of that. So thank you very much if you have sent a message telling me that. This podcast does require a little bit of work on my end, and I'm really thankful and really grateful that it's going towards something and it is getting more books on shelves. So if we're helping you out, by all means, let me know. It fills my heart. So I really appreciate anything that you send to the contact page at writersroutine.com. Right, enough self-gushing, I think. Justified, I would say. Anyway, this week we're with Eowyn Ivey. Her debut was The Snow Child, published to huge success about 14 years ago, sold around 1 million copies. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize on the back of it. She followed that up a few years later with To the Bright Edge of the World. And then for a few reasons, which you'll hear about, Eowyn stopped writing and was not really fussed if she ever wrote again. But then an idea came to her. An idea about her childhood and the troubles within that. And then after taking care of her parents towards the end of their life, that idea started to crystallise. It's all about Birdie and Emaleen, mother and daughter, who find the timid Arthur in the wilderness of Alaska. And they move in with him, only to discover that he can become a grizzly bear. Now, when you hear that, you might think this novel is going in a certain direction. That type of magical realism could perhaps be a bit jarring. So we discussed that, how she grounded it in reality, how she used it as a device to explore what was happening in her own life. And now it's set in Alaska, where Eowyn lives and where all her books are set, really. When you're surrounded by that wilderness, why would you set an adventure anywhere else? But we discussed bringing such a vibrant landscape like no other to life. How can you possibly do that justice with words on a page? We learn how she has discovered the key to writing is flexibility. If you have a story to tell, make time to write it no matter what is happening, but also work with what's going on with you. and we discuss how much Eowyn thinks about genre. Is that something she's concerned with? Why does she write? What's the purpose of it? Why does she want to tell these stories? We find out, and so much more about her working day. So let's dive into it, as we always do, with what Eowyn Ivey sees around her in the place where she sits down to write.
Well, right now I'm in my my home office, so it's just in the second floor of my house. My husband built it for me. It's got some bookshelves and a bulletin board. But to be completely honest, this isn't actually where I did most of my writing for my newest book. So normally I'd be able to look out my window and I would be able to see the spot that I normally work at. But it's pitch dark out right now. It's very this is a dark time of year in Alaska. But I actually have a little writing spot. It used to be my children's tree house that then got lowered to the ground and was a playhouse. And then we converted into sort of a writing shed for me. So that's actually where I did the majority of my writing recently.
So when you thought about converting it into a writing shed and you got the chance to almost kit it out with what you felt you needed to write, what did you surround yourself with in the shed?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that was the advantage of the place, is there was really nothing in it. So, I didn't have all the distractions of my home. I had a very small little metal desk, and there's happened to be bunk beds in there, but I avoided trying to take naps on them if I was writing. But there was really not much else. I would bring a little a thermos full of tea, and I would bring my laptop. And eventually, I tried it out the first summer, and it worked so well for me to just sort of get away from my house and away from all the distractions here, that when winter came on, my husband for Christmas got me a little wood stove so that I could keep it heated. There's no electricity, there's no plumbing. It's just a very simple little place. So we put a little wood stove in it, and that became part of my routine each day too. As I would go to write, I would start a little fire in the wood stove, and that would kind of be part of getting me into the mode, I think, of doing my work.
And so is it just you in there with a laptop? I mean, is it basic enough that it's just you in there writing by hand? I mean,
yeah, so I do bring my laptop up there, and I mean, I kind of tricked myself. The truth is our Wi-Fi almost reaches that far, so I could actually have internet, but I pretend that I don't have any internet. I put my computer, into disconnect mode, and I would bring a couple books with me. It's a little bit of a hike up to it, so I would have a backpack, and I would bring a couple little reference books that I felt like I needed that particular day. But that was really it. And I think that's what worked well for me. I had a lot of distractions in my life as I was trying to write this book, and to just kind of peel everything away and feel like I was sort of transitioning into a place where all it was just me and my work. And that really helped me a lot.
Now, you're in Alaska, and fans of your writing and your novels set in Alaska I think will be very critical of me because of the way that you describe Alaska and the environment and the luscious landscapes in your work, if I don't get you to do it here on the show. So what can you see outside of the writing shed? What's through the window, if there is one? Just talk us through the landscape.
Yeah, well, I think that's the one thing that works so well for me, because my writing is so based in the land, that when especially the first summer that I started working up there, I had just mosquito mesh across the doors and the windows. So I had the door open and the window open with mosquito mesh to keep the mosquitoes out. But sitting there, I could hear all the birds sort of trilling in the trees. And the view from there is just magnificent. It looks out over our house, but towards the Talkeetna Mountains. And so I can see the mixed forest that surrounds us, which is like birch and spruce and cottonwoods. And then through the trees, I can see the mountains, which in the wintertime, this time of year, they're covered in snow. And it's a real basic kind of shelter, so it's not very well insulated. It has a metal roof. And so sometimes during the summer, it would be pouring rain, and I could hear the rain tinkling on the roof, and I could hear the birds fluttering around. And it just felt very, I think it works so well because that's what I'm writing about. And so it kind of put me in the place and reminded me what's important to me, what I enjoy writing about. The squirrels chirping and running around on the tree branches, all that just sort of immersed me into the landscape, I think.
Now, this is a question that's slightly aside from the writing and where you write. I'm just fascinated by the fact that you are in Alaska. I've never spoken to anyone from Alaska before, but you are, you are a part of the States, but it's almost 3,000 miles away from it. How closely do you feel a tie to, I guess, the rest of the States and everything else that happens there? I mean, we're at a time when you're shortly about to have another president officially sworn in, and it's a strange old place to be. How closely tied do you feel to the rest of your grand country?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I do first and foremost think of myself as an Alaskan rather than American. I mean, it just feels very much Alaska does feel very separate in ways. I mean, certainly we see the repercussions of elections and things. It certainly affects us up here with the amount of federal lands that we have and different things. But I think identity-wise, Alaska is more important to me in a sense than identifying as American. And you're right. I mean, we border with Canada. We don't border with the United States in terms of direct contact. And to get to the United States, the contiguous 48 states, we have to go either by air or drive through Canada or go by boat. So we are a little bit isolated up in our own little world. And I think we are different in ways I feel like are good. I love Alaska. I've always lived here. So it's very much a part of my identity, I think.
You say it's part of your identity, and we'll get into the novel in a little bit, but your third novel, much like your first two, have been so steeped in not just Alaskan geography, but also the culture and the identity of what it is to be Alaskan, as you say. Why is it really important that you tell those stories? Is it something that you're seeking out to do, or is it simply that that's what you know and you're writing what you know?
Yeah, I think it is about writing what I know, but I will, I have to admit, when I was a young person growing up here, especially, during those ages that we go through in early teenage years, I felt a little bit claustrophobic in Alaska. Like I thought, I want to live all these other places. But then when the time came and I did live outside of Alaska, going to university and things and traveling, and I realized, I think in the absence, being away from Alaska, I didn't realize how different my experiences had been growing up here from the rest of the world in many ways. And that sort of opened my eyes and made me realize, no, this place is important to me. And it's important to me for it to be viewed, I guess like a lot of places, it can get kind of idealized in ways that maybe aren't entirely true to the place. And so I am interested in telling both the beautiful and maybe more difficult aspects of what it means to live in Alaska. And that is sort of become my goal as a writer, I think, in ways, at least for now, that's what I'm interested in writing about.
Let me plonk you back in the writing shed. So it's just you and the laptop? You bring these couple of books along with you. Where does all of the research and the plotting exist? Do you have Post-it notes around you? Are they in a notebook? Are they all on the laptop too? Run us through that side of things.
Sure. Well, and that's kind of this interesting situation. So like I said, where I am right now as I'm speaking to you is in my home office, which is I have a library. I have a ton of research books. And in here, I do have a bulletin board, a cork board where I put up images or poems that I come across, quotes, different things that inspire me. All that is in here in this little home office where I've got my internet. I check my email. I respond to things. I do kind of that kind of work in here. But I think what worked for me well was to kind of I do love doing research. And so all the books that I surround myself with, all the photos from the adventures I went on as I was doing research are all here in this home office. But it was important for me to kind of step away from all that, I think. And I almost feel like it was sort of a metaphorical stepping away from, I think, my own expectations of myself, the books I've already published, the things that have already happened, and removing all that and stripping it all away and just me and the laptop. That's really what it all comes down to ultimately. I think sometimes I can distract myself with everything else, but really when it comes down to it, it's just me putting words on a page. And that was that transition I could make going up to that writing shed. I think what I've realized as a writer now working on my third book was that I constantly have to adapt, right? Our lives are in flux all the time and things change. So when I was writing The Snow Child, I had a certain kind of routine, which was I had a brand new baby and an 8-year-old daughter, and I was working part-time at a bookstore. So I had this little sliver of time in the evening where my husband would say, I'll take care of the kids, you go write for an hour. And so I would rush up to my little working space and write for an hour. Well, now I'm in this sort of luxurious space where I can write full-time. And I am a slow writer. I won't deny it. I don't write a book a year. I will never be able to write a book a year. It takes me a long time. I'm not sure why we're all so different in those ways, but I am. But the truth is I was writing my newest book. I had a lot of difficult things in my life. Both my mom and my dad passed away separately from cancer, and I was their primary, they were divorced, and I was their primary caregivers in each instance. That all occurred during the time while I was writing this book. And so I had to find ways to find that little peaceful spot still where I could write. And it was hard. So it wasn't like every day was the same, because sometimes I would be getting up, going down to take my dad into the oncologist for treatment or whatever, coming home. And then I needed to transition away from that. So whenever I did have the time, I would say, okay, I'm going to pack up my little backpack, get my thermos of tea and go up to my writing spot and claim this hour. So it was never, I would love to say like every day I could just have it be the exact same way, but it just wasn't. And I had to carve it out as the time came. And sometimes that was in the afternoon. Sometimes that was in the morning. It was just whenever I could fit it in to everything else that we all deal with in our lives.
If you were to, I guess, try and have a guess, how often were you getting to write every week? How often were you getting to carve out that time?
Yeah, it just varied so much because there were times where I would go a month or two without really being able to write very much at all. And I would maybe just try to make some notes, on my iPhone as I was at appointments or doing different things. But then other times, I think it was the summer before I was actually able to kind of finish up the book. My father passed away, and he was the last one to pass away. And suddenly I did have that time and space, and yet it was still kind of difficult to get into the mode. But then once I did, I think, I was probably, I find that I really can only write really intensely for an hour or two a day. Now it might stretch out to several hours or 4 hours when I take into account research and reading through what I've already written. But the actual really intense hard work of writing, of producing new material, about an hour or two a day is about all I can manage.
Now, I obviously understand you were going through some pretty traumatic things in your family life at this moment. So you release The Snow Child, which is your debut. It's like it's nominated for a Pulitzer, or if you get nominated, I can't remember what the thing is, but and it sells loads and loads and loads of books, and then you release a second, and there's clamour from readers, I imagine clamour from publishers, that you publish a third. At what point, and you want to do that too, right? You want to write. At what point do you realise, oh, this is not going to be as smooth sailing as I thought it would be? And how did you make peace with the fact that you weren't going to be able to immediately get another book out and you would have to give it some time?
Well, I mean, I to be honest, none of my novels have felt particularly easy or having, I just feel like life is always full of difficulties, and I'm just not someone who's very good at blocking out everything else, good and bad, that happens in life. So each one of my books, I felt like there were things I was dealing with besides just the writing. But I think we just take it as it comes. And fortunately, I had both my editor there in the UK, Marianne Harrington, my editor here in the US, Andrea Walker, and my agent were just immensely patient and supportive. And they knew some of the things I was going through. But they also knew that I just needed to take the time with the book that I needed. And I'm very, very fortunate that way. As far as like the pressure of readers wanting another book, I'm honored if someone happens to say, oh, I'd love to read another book from you. But that doesn't necessarily feel like pressure. I mean, I've said to my husband and my daughters, each time I finished a book, I have said, that's it. That's the last one I'm going to write. I'm not going to write another one. I said it after The Snow Child initially, and I said it after To the Bright Edge of the World, and I'm saying it now because I do find it, I don't find it as easy as maybe some people do. I don't know. I think maybe most writers find it difficult in ways, but I don't find it a particularly easy, restful process writing a book. And so when I'm done, I feel kind of like I have put everything I have into it, and there is nothing left. And it takes me a while to realize like, oh, maybe maybe there's some more in there. Maybe, I don't know.
If you finish every novel thinking I ain't doing that again, what draws you back then?
I feel like it's just this feeling I can't resist. I think that when I'm out, for a run or a ski, or I'm washing dishes, my brain just goes there almost against my will. I start thinking of storylines or things I want to express, and it feels like I keep getting kind of pulled in against my will to some extent. And it has happened already. I'm already starting to toy with ideas, and my family laughs at me because I think, no, I don't want to do this again in ways. There's certainly parts of it that I really enjoy. I feel like there's these moments where, things just click and you're writing and it feels like I'm doing what I've always wanted to do and it's working. But other times it's a struggle. It's hard work. And I'm always a little resistant to go back into that process.
Well, as I mentioned, because a lot of the authors I speak to will write at least one novel a year, it means they're quite considered and thoughtful about their routine and about what works best for them. Whereas because you are aware it takes you a little longer and you're perfectly fine with that, how much are you thinking about ways that you can work better, ways that you can be more efficient with your time, with creativity? Are you concerned with that at all?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is that, I feel like getting into that mindset of being able to write, for me, it's not like I can just flip a switch. And I do think routines are part of that sort of, like I say, for me, going up to the little writing shed that I have, to me, that was giving me a way to transition that routine of walking up the hill, starting my little fire, pouring my cup of tea, and kind of getting into that quiet space. That all was so important to me because before I figured out, I feel like every time I write a book, I'm trying to look for new tricks to kind of get myself into that writer's mode. And over the years, sometimes it's been going to the local coffee shop to write, or changing things up a little bit, or making sure that every day when I can, I'm at the computer at a certain time, or that I have to write 500 words a day or whatever. Like I've tried, I think, just about every trick I can think of to help myself get into that creative mindset. And so I think it's a changing thing for me. It evolves, it changes what that routine is, but I'm always open. And I love that you do this podcast because it's something I'm fascinated by, as far as like what writers do to get themselves, into what I think some people call flow, where things are just coming to you and you're able to get completely into the mindset of it.
Do you kind of forget how to do it to a degree? When you first start writing again after a little while, it takes writers a long time to know their voice, to get their craft, and that often comes with more than 3 novels. As you get back into writing, does it all come flooding back?
Well, I guess every book is different. Every paragraph is different, right? So, I've been writing my whole life. I was a journalist for many years, and I've always been writing on some level. So it's not like I ever step away from it in a sense. It's always right there. It's very much a part of who I am. So in terms of like putting words together, I can do that all day long, any day, But I think what's difficult is kind of accessing the deeper sort of metaphors and themes that you're trying to access and bring across in your writing, and sort of bringing that whole world that you've created, word by word, bringing it to life for readers so that they are entering into it too. Sometimes it feels like a bit of a magic trick, to be honest. I can, like I say, I could write a few paragraphs about, for a newspaper. I could do that in a heartbeat. But that sort of bringing people into a completely different world, into the minds of characters, it takes some kind of a different thing than just putting the words together, I think. And that's where the challenge comes from me. So
that's the routine of the day. And as I say, we'll get to Blackwood's Blue Sky in just a second. I'm really interested in like the gestation of how the novel comes to be. So, you finish your second book, you're saying, I'm never doing that again. But then this novel, this idea kind of tugs, it pulls at you, teases you back in. What are you doing when you've had that first idea? How much time are you giving yourself before you're going to try and write it? And how much planning are you doing before you're typing that first sentence?
Yeah, I mean it's quite a long time, I think, really, before I mean, like with the case of each novel, they were each ideas that were with me for quite some time before I said, okay, I do think this is the story that I want to try to tell next. And during that time, I find myself looking at, artwork and other books and listening to music, things that feel like they're sort of threading into this idea that I have. They're sort of filling the well that I'm going to rely on later as I'm writing it. So that can take, I mean, quite some time. And in the case of Blackwood's Blue Sky, this is an idea, a story that I've wanted to tell or express in some way since I was a little girl. So it's something that I've had collections of ideas and children's books and things that have surrounded me my entire life that I realized I was slowly trying to sculpt into something. So it's often, and the truth is too, there's been many ideas that I've had over the years where I've gotten a notebook. Even I've gotten to that point where I got a notebook and I started cutting out pictures that were inspiring to me, and I started plotting out storylines, and then I realized, oh, this one's not going to work, and so then I ditched that. So it's a constant kind of. That's what I mean about, like, even though when I'm away from writing, I'm not technically writing something, my brain is still very much engaged with all that process, I think.
Those ideas that didn't go anywhere, you just say, oh, that's not going to work. But how do you, like, what's not working?
Well, I don't know. I think sometimes I just realize I'm bored with the idea. Like, I don't think it's going to do what I wanted it to do, or it's a feeling, that I was interested in at one point and now I'm not. Sometimes, to be honest, it's something that I'll run across, with my agent. I'll run through it with him and I'll say, hey, what do you think? And he'll say, I don't know. I'm not really that intrigued. And I really trust him. He's someone I can really, the truth is I don't want to spend, like you point out, it takes me a while to write a novel. So I don't want to spend 5 or 10 years working on something and then turn it into my agent and have him say, yeah, nobody's really interested in publishing this, And so to be able to run ideas by him or by my editor and say, hey, what do you think about this? Does that sound intriguing to you? That's part of the process too. Or with my husband and my daughters, I'll throw ideas out to them. And sometimes they'll say, oh, wow, that sounds really interesting, and then I'm thinking, oh, okay, maybe this is something I'll pursue more. But like, ideas come and go all day long, but it's more figuring out the ones that I'm willing to spend years and years working on.
Is the amount of time that you take to write, and I fully appreciate there was a lot going on, and there's no judgment over you taking a little while to write a book, by the way, but is it frustrating for you as a writer who wants to get stuff out there?
No, I don't. I don't really feel a compulsion to, like, I have a lot of respect for writers who produce books, annually or whatever. I think it's amazing, but I don't feel that compulsion. And I do feel a certain peace with, like, if I don't write another book right now, I'm okay with that. Like, I'm very content with what I've done. I feel like I've expressed a lot of the things that I wanted to express, and I don't feel like it's. I feel like it's one aspect of my life. Do you know what I mean? I have so many other aspects of things that I enjoy doing that if I don't write another book, I will be just fine. And I don't feel a compulsion to get things out in a certain time, except for the fact that, if I have a signed contract with an editor, with a publishing house, then I'm working with them. And I recognize that they have goals. They need things within a certain amount of time. And that's helpful to me in ways to be under the gun a little bit, as far as getting things done. But beyond that, I'm okay with taking my time and maybe or maybe not writing another one.
If I were to introduce myself to you at a party, and I would say, hey, I'm Dan, I'm a podcaster. I mean, believe that, that's ridiculous. But what do you say back to people? Because you just said that this is only one facet of your life and your personality. Do you identify yourself as a writer like that?
Well, I think if it's in terms of like what my occupation is, then certainly, and I tend to kind of ease into it because it's an odd thing where I've had a certain amount of success with my books, but novelists in general are not particularly famous. So I always kind of ease into it. I'll say, if someone says, well, what do you do for a living? And I'll say, oh, I'm a writer. And if they're more interested, they'll say, well, what do you write? And I'll say, I write fiction. And they'll say, well, have you ever had anything published? So I kind of let them guide the conversation. If it's something they're interested in, I'll tell them more. I have had it happen, which has been kind of a fun thing where I'll say, oh, I'm a writer. What do you write? Go back and forth. And they'll say, well, what books have you published? And I'll say The Snow Child. And they'll say, oh, I read that, which is always kind of a fun surprise when that does happen. But yeah, I mean, certainly as an occupation, that's what I've always been, as a writer and a reader. That's what I've done for a living. But yeah, it's not, if someone was to say, well, how do you spend every day? You know, there's a lot of different ways I could answer that question besides just writing.
And the grand what if you say if The Snow Child had not had the success that it had, if your debut was just fine, you know, it sold a few copies and you got the chance to write another one. How do you perceive your approach to writing might have changed? Would you have still published 3 books in 14 years? Might you have been a bit more prolific? Would you have stopped altogether? What do you think?
Oh, I think it would have been exactly the same. I mean, the truth is when I'm actually writing, it's not like I'm contemplating my Amazon reviews or what success I've had or not had or failure. Like, you really can't think about. I find I cannot let that stuff in while I'm writing. So I have no doubt that everything would have unfolded the same way, except for I don't know, in terms of getting published, I'm very fortunate that The Snow Child did as well as it did, because it allows me opportunities to have editors look at my work and be interested in it maybe more quickly than they would have been otherwise. So that's that's the greatest blessing of having a book do well, is that you're taken seriously as you're working on something. But beyond that, it wouldn't, the success or failure of a book doesn't really affect what I do next. As I said, that kind of just comes from some sort of internal drive as I slowly start to get interested in something new, a new story to tell.
More with Eowyn in just a second. I just want to pop up to say, well, thank you very much for listening, as always. And as I mentioned at the start, thank you if you've sent a message saying how inspirational and influential this podcast has been for you. If that's you, and if there are many ways that you can, I guess, say thank you to the show and help me carry on doing this, to help me continue spending time, dedicating time to bringing you conversations with the world's greatest authors more or less every week. The best way is on Patreon or Ko-Fi. By becoming a backer on Patreon, that happens monthly for as long as you want, really. It could be 1 month. It just helps you pledge to support us in any small way that you can, and it keeps things rolling, it keeps things ticking over. For that backing, just a few dollars a month, it gives you merch, there is bonus content, and there is always a way for your book to sponsor this show. If you've written something, if you think it deserves more plugging, let me do that for you. You can always do it as a one-off as well. I know that might be a much more convenient way for you to support the show, to not have any commitment at all, just by donating and tipping whatever you like on our Ko-Fi page, ko-fi.com/writers routine. On there, you can send whatever you like my way. It just comes to me and it helps me carry on bringing you these chats as often as I can. So if you would like to support the show, and just you listening is enough, I promise, but if you would like to just do a little bit more, you can do that on our Patreon or Ko-Fi page. The links are in the episode notes or wherever you're listening. Let's get back to it with Eowyn then, chatting about her new novel, Blackwood's Blue Sky. You can hear about the writing of it, how it helped her unpack her childhood, also why she writes. If she does it every few years and she doesn't think she'll return and then she ends up writing again, why does she do that? What's the point? What's the purpose in getting these stories out there? We discover, and we get back to it, talking about when she knew the new novel was starting to become clear and she could get a sense of how it might end.
To be honest, as difficult as it was to lose both my parents during that time, I think because this book does deal with some aspects of my childhood, the little girl, there's a main character in the book who's a little girl, Emaleen. She's very autobiographical in terms of like the fears and the things that a child feels in certain situations. And I think that once my mother passed away first, and when my father passed away, it did change my relationship with the story. Like suddenly suddenly I felt freer to really get at what I wanted to say. And within, a month or two, things really were clicking into place, and I started writing more quickly, and I saw the end in sight. I think another aspect that happened was finding Emeleen's voice. So the little girl, originally there weren't really chapters from her perspective as a young child. And once I found that voice, that was another kind of breakthrough moment for me, where I realized how I could tell the story and allow her to express some of the things that she was witnessing and experiencing as a 6-year-old. So those two things kind of opened the floodgate, so to speak, to where I could suddenly really be more productive.
How much do you think about genre when you're writing and where this will sit in the bookshelves?
Well, I don't think about it, which I think probably publishers might not like to hear that. I think that genres are most useful, frankly, I think for selling books. And I don't mean that like in a like a critical way. As a former bookseller, like it's helpful if someone comes in, they say, "Hey, I read Larry McMurtry. What could you recommend for me?" And I can take them over to the Western Americana section and say, "Hey, here's a whole bunch of books that might appeal to you." It's useful as a reader finding the books that you want to find. It's useful for a publisher in terms of publishing what people, targeting it towards people, what they're looking for. As a writer, though, like I'm interested in all kinds of genres. Like I read a lot of different kinds of books. And I think to some extent that's reflected in my writing. And I don't worry about it, which again might not be smart if you're trying to write a book a year and be prolific and be productive. It makes more sense maybe to have a specific shelf in the bookstore in mind that you're targeting. But I don't do that, and I just write what I want to write.
Well, the new novel is Blackwood's Blue Sky, Eowyn. Just I know that this has been a long time coming and it's kind of picked apart from a few different ideas, but tell us about the first moment that you had the idea for what led to this novel when you realised, after publishing your second, that you were going to have to write a third.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it was something that had been with me my whole life. And I really think it was a drive that I had to become a writer at all, really, was to tell this story. I just didn't know how to do it. And I think that there was at some point where it seems obvious. I've over the years as a child and in my young adulthood, I collected, fairy tales and particularly retellings of Beauty and the Beast and East of the Sun, West of the Moon are both fairy tales that I've always just been really fascinated by. And it was like suddenly just something clicked and I thought, wait, this is the path in. This is how I can tell this story. And I think it was, sometime after To the Bright Edge of the World was out. I don't find that I'm particularly productive in my thinking as a writer when I'm doing book tours and interviews. But after the calm sets in, things are quieter, then that's when I start. So I think it was, sometime in 2016 that I started thinking, what, maybe there is a way for me to write this other book. And so I started playing around with this idea at that point.
When you say playing around with it, what are you doing? What are you asking? And how much do you know before you do start writing?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I'll feel like, I know, I'll start to think, I think I've got this character in mind and that character and this setting. But things constantly change. If I were to go back and look at my original notes of what I originally thought how the story was going to go and how I was going to tell it, I know many, many things have changed. But you kind of have to have faith in the moment to be like, I'm going in the right direction, So there was a lot of, like I say, I love collecting photographs of places and people that sort of remind me of the story that I want to tell or the characters that I'm imagining. So I start collecting those things. I start collecting research books. So I collected so many books about bears. I mean, both fiction and nonfiction biology books, a lot about bears, and started reading a lot about them. So, and I started doing some research trips and just here in Alaska, some sort of adventurous, fun trips that fed that desire, that kind of story. And it was a lot of taking photographs and taking notes. So yeah, there's a lot of time that I'm not really writing per se, maybe jotting down a few ideas, but mostly just gathering information.
When you say it's a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, how, when you are writing it, how strong is that at the front of your mind? How much Because if it's simply a retelling of a fairy tale, you kind of question, well, almost what, Beauty and the Beast has been told. Why do we need a retelling? So you need to do something unique and something utterly different with it. How much can something influence your writing like that without it really dripping through and becoming quite obvious?
Well, I have to say, I'm not even sure, and I've used that expression, so I'm not critical of it. I'm not sure it's a retelling, though. That's how I have explained it in ways when I was first working on it, and I was talking to my editor, because it's a kind of a shorthand to kind of get to where I'm trying to go. But the truth is, I feel like it's more of an interaction with that fairy tale. So as a kid growing up, I loved, I had a Mercer Mayer illustrated version of Beauty and the Beast. This, of course, is long before the Disney version came out. These are more the grim kind of fairy tales. And I love the story, but there were things about it that didn't ring true to me. So when I say that I'm retelling a fairy tale, it's more that I'm interacting with it. I'm questioning it. I'm saying, is it possible for someone to change just because somebody loves them, which is sort of the basic premise, right, of Beauty and the Beast, is a man who turns into a beast, but a woman's love is able to change him. I was interested in that sort of core idea and wanting to interact with that. So I think fairy tales are they're just very, very simple stories, right? So anytime you flesh that out and base it on your experiences and your life, it's going to be a different story than someone else would tell, because it's only a framework. It's not a novel, right? You have to put your own setting, your own characters, your own thoughts and questions into it, and then that's how it develops into a novel.
Well, you said it there. Fairy tales are simple, and something like a character in your novel turning into a grizzly bear, if handled poorly, could be a bit fanciful and not believable, but in quite a trite way, and almost laughable, right? So how consciously, how much did you go about making this fantasy realistic and writing it in quite a graphic and frightening way to make that moment when there is a transformation believable?
Well, I guess it kind of goes back to where I feel rooted, which is in the Alaskan landscape. So the stories or fairy tales or mythology that interest me, they interest me because somehow they're rubbing up against my experiences of living in Alaska. So when I was thinking about Beauty and the Beast, and I had this idea, what if the man turns into a bear? And of course, there's many, many stories throughout North America and really throughout the world of men who are also bears. It's a very common legend or folktale or whatever. And I was just very interested in that because I know bears well. It's something I've grown up around bears, and I find them both beautiful and frightening. And so that's what I'm writing into. But even with my knowledge, having grown up in Alaska and spent so much time in the wilderness, like I did a lot of research having to do with, I spent 2 weeks in a remote hunting camp on Kodiak Island where the world's largest brown bears live. And during that time, I was just observing brown bears in the wild, watching how they interact, watching their behavior, because I wanted to get that character right. I wanted that character to be as close to a bear as we can imagine a man to be. So that's how I feel like I can flesh out a fairy tale in a sense. But I will say that, like, this isn't everyone's cup of tea, right? There is a certain amount of suspension of disbelief that has to happen to accept that a man can also be a bear. And this isn't going to be, my books aren't for everyone. I feel like the one advantage I have now is if you've read The Snow Child, you kind of know what I'm interested in as a writer, and you can expect that throughout my books, which is going to be, they're going to be in Alaska, and there's going to be some, what some people call magical realism. I'm not really sure that's the right term, but there's going to be something kind of supernatural or otherworldly. So if you're not interested in that kind of a story that's a little bit fantastical, then my books aren't for you, and they might seem unbelievable or whatever. But if you're willing to sort of suspend disbelief and enter into this world, then I think within the context of the world, it all makes sense.
You've spoken that the character's transformation in this is a way for you to talk about what was at times quite a tricky childhood and your father's issues with violence towards you all. How did you go about being creative with something that can be so raw and quite traumatic? Like you've lived with this, you've thought about it a lot, and now you need to be creative and quite fantastical to make it a good plot. How on earth did you manage it, and did it ever get easier?
Well, I feel like that's what I love that part of writing, which is where you're taking sort of, and I think this is true for all writers, you're taking some aspect of yourself, often something, that you're trying to figure out, that you're thinking about and maybe troubled or interested in, and you're transforming it into hopefully something that's art. And I think there's something really beautiful and incredible about that process. And I find it very freeing. It's sort of like I transform it. I take this thing that was very difficult and at times frightening and sad, and I turned it into what to me feels like an adventure and a survival story, and transform it into a story that people will hopefully enjoy and read. And then it's kind of a way of setting it free. It's sort of like, okay, I'm done with that now. It's been turned into something more beautiful, and I can set it free into the world, and I'm happy to do that.
In writing this book that you never thought you would, if you were to move on and write the fourth novel that you kind of said you've got an idea, again, tempting you back with, what have you learned from writing this about how you write best that maybe will impact the way that you work on a next novel?
Well, I think it's impossible to say because we just can't predict life, right? Like I'm very content with my life right now. I'm very happy with it, but we just never know what's coming around the corner next. And so I feel like what I've learned, and I've learned again and again with each book, is that I have to be adaptable. If I'm going to write, I have to be open to the idea that things are going to change, circumstances are going to change, new challenges and new gifts will come along, and that I just have to kind of roll with it, and not be too hard on myself if things take longer, or just make room for it in my life, but realize that life still goes on, and you have to work around all those things that come and go, the good and the bad.
And I mentioned that I speak to a lot of authors, and quite many of them are quite genre focused, so they can really easily distill why they write. If they're a mystery author, it's because they like to set up a puzzle and they want to see if you can solve it at the same time as them. If they're a rom-com author, it's because they want to make you feel, they want to make you laugh. Why do you write? When you do get drawn back time and time again to write a novel, what's the purpose of why you're doing this, do you think?
I think that oftentimes there's something that I am trying to understand, about myself or about the world, that I want to wrestle with a little bit, that I want to try to. And the truth is oftentimes by the end, I'm left with some of the same questions that I went in with, but I enjoy that process. And I think it has to do with figuring out who we are as humans, what it means to love and live and lose people, things like life and death and love. I mean, I think these are things that all writers on some level are often dealing with. And that's what I'm interested in too. And I think that, I think that connection as a child, when I read books and I recognized something from my own life or my own experience within that book, I felt less lonely. I felt connected to other humans in some way when I could spot in a book that I was reading something that I could relate to. And I love it when that happens the other way around now as a writer, when someone reads one of my books and comes up to me and says, I too had a difficult childhood and I see myself in Emaleen and I was cheering for her. Like, that makes me happy. Like, I think it's about human connection, really. I think that's really what it comes down to me ultimately.
And that's it for this week's Writer's Routine with Eowyn Ivey. The new novel is Blackwood's Blue Sky. If you'd like a copy, please do think about using the Writer's Routine bookstore at bookshop.org. On there, it helps your local independent bookshop, it helps the authors, and it helps this podcast too. More or less every book that you've heard featured on the show will be there. There is also my recommendations, there is also recommendations from listeners, and there's the classic books that are always brought up that just help you write as well. So that's uk.bookshop.org/shop/writers routine. The link is in the episode notes. As is places where you can support us, Patreon and Ko-Fi. You can get in contact too. And maybe you'd like to see these episodes episodes fully visualized, you can find those on our YouTube channel. Link is in the episode notes. And I will see you next week with a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. Until then, thanks for listening.